I am Clara, and I am 28 years old. For as long as my memory stretches back, my father continuously told me that I was far too pretty to be his biological child. He bitterly claimed that my bright blonde hair and pale blue eyes were undeniable, living proof of my mother's ultimate betrayal. He relentlessly accused her of having a sordid affair. He treated my very existence like walking, breathing physical evidence of a horrific crime she had never actually committed. When he aggressively demanded that I submit to a formal DNA paternity test before he would even consider walking me down the aisle at my wedding, I finally broke down and agreed to do it. But the clinical results didn't just unequivocally prove him wrong about the fictional affair. They proved that I was not his daughter, and shatteringly, I was not my mother's daughter either. What we ultimately uncovered hiding in the dusty archives of the hospital where I was born made my arrogant father literally fall to his knees in weeping agony in front of 60 staring relatives. Before we dive deep into this rabbit hole, if you find yourself captivated by stories of unearthing buried truths and shattering toxic family secrets, please take a quiet moment to engage with this narrative. But only do so if this journey truly resonates with the scars on your own soul. Drop your current geographic location and your local time in the comments below. I would absolutely love to know exactly where in the world you are listening to my voice from right now. Now, let me drag you back 6 agonizing weeks to the exact night my father proudly issued his devastating ultimatum. It was a tense, quiet Sunday evening dinner at my parents' sprawling estate in the affluent suburbs of a coastal New England town. It was a massive, 6-bedroom, historic Tudor-style mansion that my father absolutely loved to aggressively remind us he had purchased with the blood and sweat of his own 2 bare hands. The formal dining room gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier, reflecting off the expensive, dark mahogany furniture and the pristine, imported fine china that my mother obsessively polished every single week, as if maintaining physical perfection could somehow magically protect her from his endless verbal assaults. My grandmother, Beatrice, sat rigidly at the far end of the long table, her silver hair pulled back into a severe knot, watching my father with the exact same predatory intensity a hawk uses to watch a slithering snake. My older brother, Julian, who was 31 and undeniably the flawless golden child of the family, kept his dark eyes safely glued to his plate. My mother, Evelyn, anxiously clutched her expensive linen napkin in her lap as if it were a physical lifeline. And then, Richard Sterling loudly cleared his throat. "I will absolutely not be attending your upcoming wedding, Clara," he announced. The brutal words landed in the center of the table like a live hand grenade. My mother's heavy silver fork loudly clattered against her porcelain plate. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling with sheer terror. "Please, I am begging you, not tonight." But he was already deliberately reaching into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisply folded legal document and aggressively slid it across the polished oak table directly toward my plate. "I have thought very deeply about this decision for a very long time," he stated, his voice incredibly steady, almost completely rehearsed. "I absolutely will not walk another man's bastard daughter down the church aisle. Not until we permanently settle this ugly dispute once and for all." I slowly looked down at the piece of paper. It was a formal, legal consent form for a comprehensive DNA paternity test from a highly reputable local genetics clinic. His bold, aggressive signature was already scrawled at the very bottom line. "You have exactly 6 weeks," Richard continued, leaning back in his chair. "Submit to the genetic test. Make the scientific results completely public to the entire extended family. If the science proves you are actually my blood, I will happily attend the ceremony. I will even publicly apologize to you both." He smiled, but the expression was entirely dead, absolutely failing to reach his cold eyes. "But we both already know exactly what the science will reveal, don't we?" My grandmother Beatrice's delicate teacup hit its matching saucer with a violent, sharp crack. My mother instantly started crying, silent, heavy tears rapidly streaming down her pale cheeks. And I just sat there, completely frozen, staring blindly at my father's heavy, expensive gold watch glinting under the chandelier light, thinking to myself, 28 years. He has been meticulously building the foundation for this exact moment of destruction for 28 long years. I did not pick up the pen and sign the document that night. I also did not dramatically scream or storm out of the dining room. I simply looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Thank you so much for the clear reminder of who you are, Richard. I will absolutely remember this night." And I meant every single syllable of those words. I should probably pause and explain exactly why that horrific dinner ambush did not actually surprise me in the slightest. By the time I reached the age of 28, I had intimately learned that my father's emotional cruelty followed a very specific, deeply ingrained pattern. It was as predictable as the ocean tide and twice as relentless in its erosion. I was only 7 years old the very first time I truly understood that I was considered fundamentally different and broken. I had quietly pressed my small ear against the heavy wood of my parents' locked bedroom door after hearing my mother violently sobbing inside. I clearly heard him call her a disgusting, unprintable name. "Look at that bright blonde hair on her head." He had viciously spat. "Where in the hell did that come from, Evelyn?" It certainly didn't come from my genetics. When I was 12 years old, I desperately wanted to join the middle school track and field team. Richard flatly refused to sign the basic permission slip. "I am absolutely not investing my hard-earned money or my time into raising someone else's kid," he coldly informed me, standing right in front of Julian, who had conveniently received a brand new, expensive set of golf clubs that exact same week. When I turned 18, Julian was accepted into a prestigious, incredibly expensive private university in the city. Richard proudly paid for absolutely every single cent. The exorbitant tuition, the luxury off-campus housing, the limitless meal plans, and a massive allowance for spending money. When I received my hard-earned acceptance letter to an intensive nursing program, he looked at me from across that exact same oak dining table and casually said, "Your real, biological father can foot the bill for your little degree." So, I was forced to take out massive, crippling student loans. I aggressively worked exhausting double shifts at a local, greasy diner just to survive. I finally graduated 6 grueling years later carrying over $60,000 in suffocating debt, but possessing a medical degree I had earned entirely through my own blood, sweat, and tears, completely without his assistance. But the absolute worst part of growing up in that house wasn't the total lack of financial support or the endless missed opportunities. It was being forced to witness exactly what his relentless, paranoid accusations did to my mother's soul. Every single argument they ever had, every minor disagreement about anything, the monthly utility bills, the summer vacation destinations, Julian's failing career trajectory, somehow invariably circled aggressively back to me. I was his favorite weapon of choice. I was his living, breathing evidence. I was his constant, physical reminder of her alleged, unforgivable betrayal. The very night before I finally packed my bags and left for nursing school, my grandmother Beatrice quietly pulled me aside in the dark hallway. "Meticulously keep every single medical document from the hospital where you were born," she whispered urgently, her frail grip surprisingly firm and bruising on my wrist. "Keep your original birth certificate, keep the immunization records, absolutely any old paperwork you can find. I have a very dark, sinking feeling that we might desperately need them someday." I didn't fully comprehend her cryptic warning back then, but I obediently followed her instructions and kept the fragile papers locked in a fireproof box. And 18 years later, I would finally, devastatingly learn exactly why she had ordered me to do so. That night, after the disastrous dinner, I drove the long, quiet highway back to my small apartment in the city. It was a crimped, one-bedroom unit that I had proudly furnished with cheap, second-hand thrift store pieces and pure, unadulterated stubbornness. My fiancé, Elias, was patiently waiting for me on the worn fabric couch, his laptop glowing brightly with architectural floor plans for a new client. A large glass of cheap red wine was already poured and waiting for me. He knew instantly, just by looking at the tension in my shoulders, that something catastrophic had occurred. "What exactly did the monster do this time?" he asked quietly. I numbly recounted the entire horrific scene. I told him about the DNA consent form, the public ultimatum, the strict 6-week deadline before the wedding. Elias's strong jaw tightened visibly with every single word I spoke. "Maybe you should just finally take the damn test," he suggested after a long, heavy silence. "Just take the genetic swab, definitively prove his paranoid delusions wrong once and for all, and force him to shut his mouth forever." I slowly set down my cheap wine glass, a generic purchase from a big box store, absolutely nothing like the heavy, expensive lead crystal my father drank from, and I stared down at the modest, beautiful diamond sparkling on my left hand. Elias had painstakingly designed the custom ring himself, basing it entirely on a rough sketch I had doodled in a private journal years ago. "It is absolutely not about proving him wrong anymore, Elias," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It is entirely about finally freeing my mother from her cage." Elias went completely quiet. He already knew the dark, traumatic history I was referring to. Exactly 5 years ago, I had received a frantic, hysterical phone call from grandmother Beatrice at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had walked into the master bathroom and discovered my mother unconscious on the tile floor, an entirely empty bottle of heavy prescription sleeping pills resting by her hand. The rushing paramedics had miraculously arrived just in time to pump her stomach, but it was incredibly, terrifyingly close. Ever since that horrific night, Evelyn had been heavily medicated on strong antidepressants, attending intensive trauma therapy twice a week, desperately trying to build her shattered mind back together piece by agonizing piece. Richard never once offered a single apology. He never even acknowledged what his 23 years of relentless psychological torture had ultimately driven her to do. He just stubbornly continued insisting that he was the righteous victim. My mother sacrificed 35 years of absolute, unwavering loyalty to that man, I told Elias, the tears finally spilling hot down my cheeks. Complete, undeniable faithfulness. And he maliciously repaid her devotion with 28 long years of publicly calling her a filthy liar. I aggressively picked up my cell phone and pulled up the website for a highly reputable, local genetics laboratory I had secretly researched months prior. Genesis Analytics. They were fully independent, board-certified, and most importantly, they possessed absolutely zero corporate connections to Richard's vast network. "I am going to take the genetic test," I stated firmly. "But I am absolutely going to do it on my own terms." Exactly 2 weeks later, Richard turned 60 years old. The massive, extravagant birthday party was hosted at the elite Harbor View Country Club. It featured 18 pristine holes of manicured green grass overlooking the sparkling ocean, a highly exclusive, private dining hall featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows, and 30 extended relatives eagerly gathered to celebrate the exact man who had effectively made my mother's entire existence a living prison. I wore a very simple, understated black cocktail dress. Elias tightly squeezed my hand as we walked through the heavy oak doors, leaning in to whisper in my ear, "Just 2 hours, Clara. We only have to survive 2 hours of this nonsense." We couldn't even manage that. Exactly halfway through the lavish, multi-course dinner, after consuming 3 massive glasses of incredibly expensive, vintage imported wine, Richard arrogantly stood up and tapped his crystal glass to deliver a speech. He warmly thanked every single guest for attending. He lavishly praised Julian for his supposedly brilliant, aggressive career moves in the financial sector. He condescendingly raised a glass to toast my mother for her endless patience with his demanding schedule. And then his cold, predatory eyes slowly scanned the room and locked directly onto me. "I see that my lovely daughter is physically present here tonight," he announced loudly. And he spoke the word daughter, dripping with heavy, unmistakable, sarcastic air quotes. A few of the more obnoxious relatives awkwardly chuckled into their napkins. I sincerely hope she has been thinking very deeply about our recent private conversation regarding finally proving exactly where she really comes from. The entire dining room instantly went dead, suffocatingly quiet. "Dad," Julian interjected nervously, half rising from his mahogany chair. "Perhaps right now isn't the most appropriate time for this discussion." Richard violently waved his son off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "No, no, Julian. This is exactly the perfect time. A strong family should always be entirely honest with one another." He smiled directly at me. It was that freezing, reptilian smirk I had witnessed 1,000 times before. Do any of you know exactly what they call a parasitic bird that maliciously lays its eggs in another bird's nest? He asked the crowd. A cuckoo. The cuckoo's stolen egg looks incredibly beautiful on the outside, doesn't it? But it inherently does not belong in the nest. It never, ever did. Somewhere in the rows behind me, an older aunt audibly gasped in shock. A younger cousin maliciously snickered. My mother simply stared blankly down at her lap, heavy, silent tears rapidly dripping onto her expensive gold bracelet, a lavish, hollow gilt gift Richard had casually purchased for her after one of their most explosive, violent arguments. I slowly picked up my silver fork, deliberately set it back down on the linen tablecloth, and stood up to my full height. Every single pair of eyes in the massive room instantly turned to stare at me. "Thank you so much for the public reminder of who you are, Richard," I said, projecting my voice so it was crystal clear and completely steady. "I will absolutely remember this moment." Then I slowly turned my back on him and looked at my mother. "Mom, would you please like to step outside with me and get some fresh air?" She silently reached out and took my offered hand, and together, we walked gracefully out of that suffocating room. We walked right past the cruel whispers, right past the grand staircase, and right past the arrogant man who had spent 28 years ruthlessly trying to mentally destroy both. But I was absolutely not finished. I was not even close to being done. My grandmother Beatrice rapidly caught up to us in the dimly lit parking lot, her heavy heels loudly clicking against the dark asphalt exactly like gunshots. "Clara, please wait." I stopped and turned around. Beatrice Sterling was 78 years old, possessing the rigid, flawless posture of royalty and pale eyes that absolutely never missed a single detail. She had never, ever liked Richard. That arrogant man genuinely believes he is God's ultimate gift to the business world. She had warned my mother decades ago, right before the wedding. But he is nothing more than a very small, deeply insecure man masking his fear with a massive ego. Now, she looked at me with an intense, burning emotion I had never witnessed on her face before. Absolute, frantic urgency. "There is something incredibly important I desperately need to tell you," she whispered, anxiously glancing back over her shoulder toward the clubhouse doors to ensure Richard hadn't followed us out. "Something I absolutely should have told you decades ago." She forcefully led my mother and me to a secluded wooden bench overlooking the sprawling, dark golf course. The sun was rapidly setting, painting the evening sky in violent, bruised shades of orange and dark purple, and my grandmother's voice dropped to barely above a raspy whisper. "The exact night you were born," she began, her eyes distant, "something incredibly strange and highly irregular happened at the local memorial hospital." I physically felt my mother instantly stiffen beside me on the bench. "When the exhausted delivery nurse finally brought you out to the hallway to show me, your grandfather was still alive back then, so we were both standing there waiting." She looked absolutely, completely terrified. Her hands were visibly shaking. "She practically shoved you into Evelyn's arms way too quickly, and then she literally turned and sprinted out of the hospital room." "Mom," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking with shock. "You never, ever told me this happened." "I desperately tried to investigate the incident on my own," Beatrice continued, gripping her purse tightly. "I repeatedly called the hospital administration. I demanded answers. They completely stonewalled me at every turn. They aggressively insisted everything was perfectly normal, and they permanently sealed all the medical records, citing strict patient privacy laws." Beatrice slowly reached into her leather purse and extracted a very old, deeply yellowed piece of paper. "But I managed to secretly secure a photocopy of your original birth record before they completely locked the files down in the archives." I leaned in and looked closely at the fragile document. "Time of birth, 11:47 p.m. I distinctly gave birth to you at exactly 11:58 p.m., my mother stated very slowly, the realization dawning. I specifically remember frantically staring at the wall clock because the pain of the contractions was so absolute. I vividly remember it because the attending doctor made a terrible joke about you almost being born on the exact stroke of midnight. 11 minutes. Something catastrophic had occurred during those missing 11 minutes. "I possess a name," my grandmother stated grimly. The senior head nurse on duty that specific night. Her name is Margaret Sullivan. She officially retired from medicine over a decade ago. I managed to track down her current residential address. The very next morning, I confidently walked into the Genesis Analytics laboratory office carrying 3 distinct DNA samples. My own sample was incredibly simple, a standard cheek swab securely sealed inside a sterile plastic tube. My mother's sample was completely voluntary. She had willingly handed it to me the previous night, her eyes brimming with tears, but her hands completely steady. Absolutely whatever this test reveals, she had whispered fiercely, "You are my daughter." Biology changes absolutely nothing between us. My father's sample, however, was entirely stolen. It consisted of several coarse strands of hair I had secretly plucked from the expensive bristle brush he kept in the downstairs guest bathroom. The exact same bathroom I had obediently used every single Thanksgiving and holiday for years, desperately pretending I didn't notice the way he physically flinched in disgust whenever I reached past him to grab the hand soap. The senior technician at the laboratory, a highly professional, calm woman named Dr. Eris, meticulously explained the strict chain of custody process. Verified results will be available in approximately 3 weeks. They are fully legally admissible in a court of law if required, and we guarantee absolute, ironclad patient confidentiality. I gladly paid the exorbitant extra fee for the expedited processing timeline. Grandmother Beatrice had aggressively insisted on covering the entire cost. Late that afternoon, I sat in my car and attempted to call Margaret Sullivan's phone number. The line rang 6 long, agonizing times before someone finally picked up the receiver. A woman's voice answered, sounding much older and trembling slightly with anxiety. "Hello? Mrs. Sullivan? My name is Clara Sterling. I was born at the local Memorial Hospital on the night of March 15th, 1996. I have reason to believe you were serving as the head nurse on duty that night, and I absolutely cannot help you." The words spilled out of her mouth incredibly fast, laced with pure, unadulterated panic. "Mrs. Sullivan, please, I am just begging you to answer one question. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Please do not ever attempt to contact this number again." The line went completely dead with a sharp click. I sat there and stared blankly at my phone screen for a very long moment. Elias looked up from his drafting table across the room. "What exactly happened?" he asked. She hung up on me immediately. I slowly set the phone down on the counter, but not before she completely panicked. "She absolutely knows something, Elias. She undeniably knows a massive secret." A completely innocent, confused woman would have just asked for clarification. Margaret Sullivan was absolutely terrified. Whatever horrific mistake happened on that night in 1996, she had been carrying the crushing, radioactive weight of it for 28 years. And now, so would I. Exactly 3 days later, the explosive email arrived. It was not sent to me directly. Richard was absolutely not that subtle or dignified. He maliciously mass-emailed our entire extended family network. Aunts, uncles, first cousins, distant second cousins I hadn't spoken a word to since elementary school. There were 47 distinct recipients on the list. My mother, my grandmother, and I were all publicly CC'd on the chain. The dramatic subject line simply read, "Regarding Clara's upcoming wedding." I sat alone in my car, parked outside the medical clinic where I worked, reading the text while my hands violently trembled against the leather steering wheel. "Dear family," the message began. "As the vast majority of you are well aware, I have silently carried a massive, agonizing burden for 28 long years. I have painfully endured endless, crippling doubt regarding my supposed daughter's true biological parentage, and I have been forced to watch my wife aggressively refuse to admit the ugly truth. I have formally requested that Clara take a certified DNA test and share the scientific results with our family before her wedding day. She has, so far, stubbornly refused to comply, which I strongly believe speaks absolute volumes for itself. Until this dark matter is resolved publicly, in the light of day, I will absolutely not be attending the marriage ceremony. I sincerely hope you will all understand and respect my painful position. Attached to this email is a family photograph taken from Clara's christening ceremony. I strongly invite you to look very closely at the image and draw your own logical conclusions. Regards, Richard Sterling. I clicked on the attachment. It was an old photograph I distinctly remembered seeing displayed on my grandmother's mantel. I was perhaps 3 months old, delicately cradled in my mother's arms. I had bright blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and incredibly pale skin, completely surrounded in the photo by Richard, Julian, and a dozen dark-haired, olive-skinned relatives. Richard had maliciously used a digital program to draw a thick, bright red circle directly around my infant face and added a cruel, mocking caption at the bottom, "Spot the glaring difference." Within mere hours, the chaotic responses began rapidly flooding the email chain. A small handful of relatives bravely defended my mother's honor, but the vast majority simply asked invasive, probing questions. They were careful, extremely curious, eagerly salivating over the massive family drama. Julian called my cell phone late that night. "Just swallow your pride and do exactly what Dad wants, Clara," he demanded, his voice tight with deep frustration. "You are actively making this entire situation infinitely worse. You are publicly ruining his pristine business reputation." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. I actually, genuinely laughed at the sheer absurdity of his statement. "His pristine reputation?" I repeated incredulously. "That is what you are actually worried about right now?" Julian hung up the phone without offering an answer. Exactly 3 weeks after I securely submitted the genetic samples, the notification email from Genesis Analytics finally arrived at 9:47 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday night. Elias was currently traveling out of state for work, attending a mandatory project consultation in the city that simply could not be rescheduled. I was completely alone in our apartment, picking at a half-eaten salad resting on the coffee table, my laptop open to a generic streaming service I hadn't actually been paying attention to for hours. The subject line of the email was incredibly clinical and sterile. "Your requested DNA analysis results. Secure document enclosed." I frantically typed in my complex password. I verified my secondary identity protocols. I slowly clicked open the PDF document. And then I sat there and read the text 3 entire times, because the first 2 times my brain absolutely refused to process the words. Subject A, Clara Sterling, shows a 0% genetic match with Subject B, Richard Sterling. I had fully expected that exact result. I had mentally prepared myself for it. I had even steeled my heart for the agonizing confirmation that Richard had actually been right about one specific thing, even if he was a monster about absolutely everything else. But then, my eyes slowly drifted down to the second line of text. Subject A, Clara Sterling, shows a 0% genetic match with Subject C, Evelyn Sterling. I completely stopped breathing. 0%. I was not my father's biological daughter. But unimaginably, I was not my mother's biological daughter, either. I frantically called the Genesis Analytics Emergency After Hours hotline, my voice cracking and bordering on hysteria as I aggressively demanded to speak with someone, anyone, who could logically explain this impossibility. A senior technician patiently, calmly walked me through the complex data. There was absolutely no cross-contamination in the lab. There were 0 processing errors. There was absolutely 0 statistical possibility of a mistake. The genetic samples were crystal clear. The hard science was undeniably conclusive. I was absolutely not biologically related to either of my parents, which meant, unequivocally, that my mother had never, ever cheated on him. Richard had been horribly, violently wrong about her infidelity for 28 years. But the results also meant something else. Something entirely impossible to comprehend. If Evelyn Sterling did not have an affair, if she had been utterly faithful just like she had tearfully claimed for decades, then how on earth was I not her biological child? I slid off the couch and sat heavily on my kitchen floor, my back pressed hard against the wooden cabinets, my cell phone resting dead in my lap, staring blankly up at the ceiling. For 28 years, my arrogant father had relentlessly called my mother a filthy cheater. For 28 years, he was completely, catastrophically wrong about the affair. But he was actually right about one tiny detail. I was not his daughter. The massive, terrifying question was, whose daughter was I? I drove my car over to my parents' sprawling estate early the next morning, meticulously timing my arrival for exactly 10 o'clock. It was late enough that I knew Richard would already be absent, playing his mandatory morning golf game at the club, but early enough that I knew my mother would still be sitting in her silk robe, quietly drinking her Earl Grey tea in the sunroom. She immediately looked up from her cup when I walked through the glass doors, and her face instantly creased with deep, maternal concern. "Clara, what is wrong? You look pale." I sat down heavily in the wicker chair directly across from her. I didn't say a word. I simply handed her my unlocked cell phone, with the Genesis Analytics PDF report glowing brightly on the screen. I sat in silence and watched her read the document. I watched the remaining color completely drain from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. I watched her trembling lips move silently as she read the impossible numbers again and again and again. When she finally tore her eyes away from the screen and looked up at me, her eyes were completely wild with panic. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "This has to be a catastrophic laboratory mistake." I personally called the senior lab director, Mom. I made them triple-check every single data point. There is absolutely no mistake. But I physically gave birth to you. Her voice suddenly rose in pitch, cracking violently on the jagged edges of panic. I was in agonizing labor for 14 hours. I physically felt you come out of my own body. I saw you, Clara. You were red and screaming, and you were unequivocally mine. I gently reached across the small glass table and took both of her shaking hands tightly in mine. Her skin was as cold as ice. "I absolutely believe you, Mom," I said softly. "Which means there is only one logical, terrifying explanation left. Something horrific happened in that hospital nursery. Someone physically switched us." The heavy, suffocating silence stretched between us like a piano wire about to violently snap. "The timestamps," my mother said suddenly, her eyes widening in realization. "The official birth certificate clearly says 11:47 p.m. But I specifically remember. I was staring directly at the wall clock because the final contractions were so agonizingly intense. You were physically born at exactly 11:58 p.m. I always wondered about that strange discrepancy on the paperwork. 11 minutes. 11 tiny, seemingly insignificant minutes. 11 minutes that completely, permanently altered the trajectory of two entire families forever. "Mom," I said incredibly carefully, choosing my words. "If I am absolutely not your biological daughter, that undeniably means your real, biological daughter is still out there somewhere in the world. She is 28 years old, currently living someone else's entire life." My mother finally broke down and started to violently cry. It was not the silent, suppressed, fearful tears that Richard had always provoked. These were deep, violent, body-shaking sobs that seemed to erupt from somewhere ancient and primal deep inside her soul. "We desperately have to find her," she managed to choke out between sobs. "We have to desperately find both of them." I need to pause the narrative right here for a crucial moment. If you are currently listening to my voice and you have ever deeply felt like you fundamentally did not belong inside your own family structure, like you were somehow inherently wrong or broken just for existing in their space, I truly, deeply see you. This chaotic story is far from over. The dark truth is about to become infinitely more complicated and painful. If you are heavily invested in finally uncovering exactly what happened in the shadows of that hospital ward, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling me your wildest theories about the nurse. Now, let me tell you the story of the woman who finally decided to break her 28-year silence. Richard inevitably found out about the finalized DNA test results long before I could adequately prepare a strategy. Julian, always the perfectly obedient, desperate to please son, had secretly glanced at my mother's unlocked phone screen while briefly visiting the estate for lunch, and he had seen the Genesis Analytics confirmation email. Within a single hour, my cell phone was aggressively ringing. "So?" Richard's voice was dripping with arrogant, triumphant venom before I had even managed to say hello. "What exactly did the science say? Was I completely right?" I did not answer him. I honestly could not figure out how to verbally explain the complex reality that he was simultaneously right and yet catastrophically, undeniably wrong about absolutely everything else. My heavy silence told his arrogant brain everything it desperately needed to know. I knew it. He suddenly laughed. He actually let out a loud, booming laugh of pure, unadulterated vindication. 28 agonizing years, Clara. 28 years I have been screaming the truth to everyone, and absolutely no one possessed the intelligence to believe me. But I was right. I was absolutely right all along. Richard, does your mother currently know the results? Of course, she damn well knows. She is probably sitting in that house sobbing right now, desperately trying to figure out exactly how to spin this massive lie to save her reputation. I could clearly hear his heavy footsteps as he paced his office floor, his vindictive excitement barely contained. I am immediately drafting another email to send to the entire extended family. This time, I am attaching the undeniable scientific proof. You truly do not understand the reality of the situation, I tried to interject. I understand it perfectly, Clara. You are absolutely not my blood daughter. Your deceitful mother aggressively lied to my face for nearly 3 decades, and now every single person in our social circle will finally know exactly what kind of filthy woman Evelyn Sterling truly is. He violently hung up the phone before I could even attempt to explain that Evelyn had never lied. That she had been telling the absolute truth all along. That the real, horrifying story was something none of us possessed the imagination to ever suspect. Within the very same hour, Richard called my mother and coldly ordered her to immediately pack her belongings. I want you completely out of my house before the end of the month, he stated flatly. I am entirely done financially supporting your disgusting lies. My grandmother Beatrice immediately drove her car over to the estate to physically stand guard and stay with her. When I finally arrived late that evening, I found both women sitting in the dark living room. My mother was tightly curled into the corner of the sofa exactly like a deeply wounded animal, while my grandmother stood rigidly nearby, looking exactly like a fierce, silver-haired sentinel preparing for war. He genuinely believes he has won the ultimate victory, I said quietly from the doorway. My grandmother Beatrice looked at me with those incredibly sharp, ancient, knowing eyes. Then we are going to show him the devastating rest of the story. The subsequent 3 days were unequivocally the most excruciating days of my entire life. I seriously considered permanently canceling the wedding entirely. Not because of Richard's tantrums, but because I simply could not bear the heavy thought of my mother's ultimate, painful vindication being entirely overshadowed by white tulle dresses and shallow champagne toasts. Elias absolutely refused to allow it. We are getting married on that day, he stated firmly, gently holding my face between his warm hands. Period. Your arrogant father's psychological issues are absolutely not our issues to carry. We do not postpone our joy and our life for his pathetic tantrum. But I knew I could not possibly move forward without securing the absolute truth. And the key to that truth was currently locked deep inside Margaret Sullivan's decaying memory. I aggressively called her phone number again and again. 5 separate times over the course of 3 days. Every single call went directly to her automated voicemail. On my 6th and final attempt, I left a significantly different, highly aggressive message. Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Clara Sterling. I know with absolute certainty that you recognize that name. I currently possess certified, legally admissible DNA evidence that unequivocally proves a newborn baby was swapped at the local Memorial Hospital on the night of March 15, 1996. I am absolutely not looking to maliciously blame you. I am not looking to file a massive lawsuit against anyone. I just desperately need to know exactly who I am. I paused, taking a deep, steadying breath. If you do not return my call by tomorrow, my very next phone call will be to a ruthless medical malpractice lawyer. I will legally subpoena the sealed hospital archives. I will formally file for a massive state investigation. And absolutely whatever dark secret you have been hiding for 28 years will be dragged out into the public light in the absolute worst possible way. I waited in agony for 1 hour. Then 2. At exactly 4:17 p.m., my cell phone vibrated violently with a text message from a completely unknown number. Thursday, 2:00 p.m. The old Riverside Diner downtown. Come completely alone. I sat and stared at the glowing screen for a very long time. Then, my fingers typed a rapid reply. I will be there. Whatever massive, crushing burden Margaret Sullivan had been carrying for 28 years, she was finally, desperately ready to let it go. The only real question was whether I was truly psychologically ready to hear the horror story. The old Riverside Diner was the exact kind of depressing, stagnant place that modern time completely forgot. Faded vinyl booths were heavily patched with gray duct tape, a broken jukebox strictly played oldies from the 70s, and the bitter coffee tasted exactly like it had been brewing since the Reagan administration. Margaret Sullivan was already sitting in a dark, secluded corner booth, her back pressed firmly against the wall. She was 72 years old, appearing significantly smaller and more fragile than I had mentally pictured. She had thin, silver hair pulled back into a severe, tight bun, and her spotted hands violently trembled against her white ceramic coffee mug. She slowly looked up when I slid into the sticky vinyl seat directly across from her. "You look exactly like her," she whispered quietly, her voice cracking. "Linda, your true, biological mother. You have her exact same bright hair, her exact same eyes." I physically felt my heart violently stutter in my chest. "You actually know exactly who my biological mother is?" Margaret tightly closed her eyes for a very long, agonizing moment. When she finally opened them, they were brimming with unshed tears. "I have carried this crushing weight for 28 long years," she said, her voice shaking. "Every single day of my life, waking up wondering if I did the right thing by remaining silent to protect my job. Wondering if I should have aggressively spoken up the exact moment the nightmare occurred." She slowly reached her trembling hands into her worn purse and extracted a very old, deeply cracked leather journal. Its pages were heavily yellowed and brittle with age. "This is my personal, handwritten shift log from the night of March 15th, 1996. The exact night you were born." She carefully opened the fragile book to a page marked with a sticky note and slowly slid it across the sticky table toward me. I read her cramped, hurried handwriting, my blood running absolutely freezing cold with every single line. 11:47 p.m. Baby girl number 1 safely delivered to Evelyn Sterling. Healthy, weighing exactly 7 pounds, 2 ounces. 11:58 p.m. Baby girl number 2 safely delivered to Linda Hayes. Healthy, weighing exactly 6 pounds, 4 ounces. 12:32 a.m. Major incident. A young trainee nurse, Carla Davis, accidentally mixed up the 2 infants after routine bathing. Completely failed to check the wristbands. Realized the catastrophic error at approximately 2:15 a.m. Both families had already spent hours physically bonding with the wrong infants. 2:45 a.m. Emergency closed-door meeting with the senior hospital administrator. The executive decision was made to quietly alter the medical paperwork rather than traumatize the families. Believed it would be less emotionally destructive for everyone involved. Strict non-disclosure agreements aggressively required for all staff physically present. I slowly looked up at Margaret, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them flat against the table. "They knew," I whispered in absolute horror. "They knew the truth that exact night, and they actively orchestrated a massive cover-up to save themselves." The administrator aggressively claimed it would cause significantly more psychological trauma to switch you both back. Margaret's voice violently cracked, tears finally spilling over. Both exhausted mothers had already held their babies, joyfully fed them, officially named them. I was only 24 years old at the time. The executives aggressively threatened to instantly revoke my nursing license. They threatened my pension. They forced me into a dark room and made me sign a terrifying non-disclosure agreement. I had 2 small children of my own to feed at home. I was terrified. Who exactly was the other baby? I demanded, my voice hardening. The infant who was sent home with Linda Hayes? Margaret slowly reached into her purse again and pulled out another folded piece of paper. It was a printed screenshot from a public social media profile. A woman who was exactly my age. She had thick brown hair, deep brown eyes, and a confident smile that looked absolutely, terrifyingly identical to my brother Julian's smile. "Her legal name is Sarah Hayes," Margaret said softly. "She is currently 28 years old." She resides in a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. She looked at me with ancient eyes completely overflowing with decades of rotting guilt. And she is your mother Evelyn's true, biological daughter. That night, I sat alone in the dark of my apartment, my laptop glowing brightly, open to Sarah Hayes' professional LinkedIn profile. She was a dedicated elementary school teacher working in the Boston Public School District. She was a proud graduate of a prestigious university and an active weekend volunteer at a local animal rescue shelter. Her profile picture displayed a vibrant woman with rich chestnut brown hair and warm brown eyes, standing proudly in front of a colorful classroom decorated with alphabet posters. She looked absolutely, undeniably like exactly what my brother Julian might have looked like if he had been born female. I nervously typed and deleted the message exactly 17 times before I finally found the courage to hit the send button. Hi, Sarah. This message is going to sound completely, utterly insane, and I sincerely apologize to you in advance. My name is Clara Sterling. I was born at the local Memorial Hospital on the night of March 15, 1996, the exact same night and the exact same location as you. I recently submitted to a certified DNA test that conclusively proved I am not biologically related to either of the parents who raised me. I have subsequently spoken directly with the senior head nurse who was working on duty that specific night, and she formally confirmed that 2 infants were accidentally switched in the nursery. I firmly believe that you are the true, biological daughter of Evelyn and Richard Sterling. And I firmly believe that I am the biological daughter of Linda Hayes. I currently possess hard documentation. I possess a notarized witness statement. I am absolutely not looking for anything financial or material from you. I simply believed that you deserved to know the absolute truth about your life. If you are ever willing to speak with me, please call my number. I included my personal cell phone number and quickly slammed the laptop shut before my anxiety could force me to second-guess the decision. 24 agonizing hours slowly passed. I obsessively checked my phone screen every 10 minutes, exactly like an anxious teenager desperately waiting for a text back from a crush. And then, at exactly 9:38 p.m. the following evening, my phone vibrated. Is this Clara? The voice on the other end of the line was incredibly shaky, deeply uncertain, but something inherent in its tone felt bizarrely, unexplainably familiar. Sarah. A very long, heavy pause followed, accompanied by a shuddering breath. My entire life, people have constantly joked that I don't look a single thing like my parents. My dad, well, the man who legally raised me, he used to always laugh and joke that maybe the hospital made a massive mistake in the nursery. We all just laughed about it. She let out a sudden sound that was half a bitter laugh, half a broken sob. I guess it wasn't actually a joke after all. We talked on the phone for over 3 continuous hours that night. By the end of the exhausting conversation, we had both firmly agreed to immediately take another set of DNA tests. This specific test would directly compare Sarah's genetics to Richard and Evelyn's DNA. The expedited results would be ready in exactly 10 days, which was perfectly timed, arriving just 2 days before my massive engagement party. Over the course of the next week, I meticulously built my case exactly like a ruthless prosecutor preparing for the trial of the century. First, the hard documents. I possessed my original, certified Genesis Analytics report unequivocally showing a 0% match with both Richard and Evelyn. I securely held Margaret Sullivan's original, handwritten shift log from 1996, which she had finally, reluctantly agreed to let me photograph. I also possessed a formally notarized legal statement from Margaret, signed under oath before an independent witness at her attorney's private office. It was her own personal decision, she claimed, to finally clear her rotting conscience before she died. The hospital executives aggressively threatened me for 28 years, she told me when I picked up the heavy document. I am 72 years old now. What exactly are they going to do to me? Fire me from my retirement? Second, the genetic proof. Sarah had successfully submitted her DNA samples to Genesis Analytics utilizing the exact same expedited processing channel I had used. Her explosive results comparing her to Richard and Evelyn would arrive 48 hours before the engagement party. Third, the key witnesses. My grandmother Beatrice would absolutely be sitting in the front row, of course. She had been patiently, fiercely waiting 28 years for this exact moment of reckoning. Margaret Sullivan had bravely agreed to physically attend the event, sitting quietly in the back corner of the room until she was called upon. And Sarah, my biological sister in spirit, if not in actual genetics, would be patiently waiting in the private room right next door. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Elias asked gently as we reviewed the battle plan together at our kitchen table. Confronting him so publicly, there is absolutely no taking it back once the words leave your mouth. I thought deeply about my mother. I thought about the empty bottle of prescription sleeping pills on the bathroom floor. I thought about 28 agonizing years of being viciously called a liar, a filthy cheater, a complete disappointment. He aggressively demanded a massive public reckoning, I stated coldly. He maliciously sent that accusatory email to 47 different people. He publicly called me a parasitic cuckoo's egg in front of the entire extended family. I carefully straightened the massive stack of legal documents resting on my desk. He absolutely does not get to slink away privately into the shadows now. Every single person who blindly believed his toxic lies needs to bear witness to the absolute truth. Elias nodded his head slowly. Then let's give them a theatrical show they will never, ever forget. Exactly 3 days before the grand engagement party, Sarah's expedited DNA results finally arrived in my inbox. Subject A, Sarah Hayes, shows a 99.97% genetic match with Subject B, Richard Sterling. Subject A, Sarah Hayes, shows a 99.98% genetic match with Subject C, Evelyn Sterling. I sat and read the impossible numbers 3 times in a row, hot tears rapidly streaming down my face. Then I immediately called Sarah. "Can you possibly meet me tomorrow in person?" We strategically chose a busy coffee shop located exactly halfway between my city and Boston, neutral, safe ground for 2 young women whose entire biological lives had just been violently rewritten by hard science. She was already sitting there when I walked through the door, occupying a quiet corner table with 2 completely untouched lattes. When she finally looked up and saw me approach, she stood up so incredibly fast her wooden chair nearly tipped over backward. For a very long, surreal moment, we simply stood there and stared at each other in silence. She had thick brown hair, deep brown eyes, a strong, distinct jawline that I had seen on Julian 1,000 times growing up, and a subtle, deep dimple on her left cheek, the exact same dimple Richard had. And I had bright blonde hair, pale blue eyes, a tiny button nose, and fair skin that perfectly matched the old photographs Margaret had shown me of Linda Hayes. We were 2 complete strangers who were biologically supposed to be sisters. Sisters who were tragically raised by the entirely wrong families. "This is incredibly weird," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Then, she let out a nervous laugh. And I laughed back. And suddenly, we were fiercely hugging each other right in the middle of a crowded coffee shop, openly crying into each other's shoulders while the baristas awkwardly pretended not to notice the scene. "I desperately want to meet them," Sarah said when we finally pulled apart and sat down. "Evelyn and Richard. My biological parents." "You absolutely will," I promised her fiercely. In exactly 3 days. I deliberately chose not to warn her that one of those biological parents would be weeping on his knees the moment she walked into the room. The extravagant engagement party was hosted at the historic Sterling estate, my grandmother's massive family home, a sprawling Georgian manor featuring endless rose gardens and sparkling fairy lights meticulously strung through century-old oak trees. She had aggressively insisted on hosting the event. "I want to give you a proper, elegant celebration in a secure location where Richard's massive ego cannot possibly dictate the terms," she had declared. 60 invited guests arrived that evening dressed in formal cocktail attire. Aunts and uncles, distant cousins, family friends, and absolutely every single person who had unfortunately received Richard's vile, accusatory mass email. I wore a stunning, simple navy blue designer dress, and I carried myself exactly like a woman who already knew she had won the war. Elias remained incredibly close to me all evening, his warm hand resting on the small of my back, remaining as steady and grounding as a mountain. My mother, Evelyn, arrived arm in arm with my grandmother. Her eyes were still visibly red and puffy from days of relentless crying, but her posture was significantly straighter and prouder than I had witnessed in years. Something fundamental had dramatically shifted inside her soul since we had uncovered the undeniable truth. A massive, crushing weight had been lifted from her shoulders even before the public vindication had occurred. And then, Richard finally arrived. He purposefully arrived late, of course. Fashionably late, as he loved to arrogantly call it. Deliberately letting the crowd gather, letting the anxious anticipation build in the room. He wore a flawless, custom Tom Ford suit, his heavy Rolex watch aggressively catching the light of the crystal chandeliers, a smug, superior smirk playing constantly at the corners of his mouth. He arrogantly believed this party was going to be his ultimate victory lap. He had absolutely no idea. I quietly watched him aggressively work the room, forcefully shaking hands, soaking up the congratulations and hollow sympathy from relatives who blindly believed his twisted version of events. Such an incredibly difficult, embarrassing situation for you, I overheard one older aunt murmur to him sympathetically. "You have been so unbelievably patient through it all." Julian stood awkwardly beside him, looking visibly uncomfortable but remaining entirely compliant, the eternally loyal, obedient soldier he had always been programmed to be. In the far, dark corner of the massive room, Margaret Sullivan sat incredibly quietly with a simple glass of ice water, her frail hands still noticeably trembling after all these years. And, waiting patiently in the private parlor next door, safely hidden behind a heavy mahogany door that connected directly to the main hall, Sarah Hayes quietly waited for her cue. I quickly checked my phone screen. Elias offered a single, firm nod. It was time. Exactly halfway through the elegant cocktail hour, Richard loudly tapped a glass and demanded a microphone. The entire room instantly quieted down as he confidently stepped onto the small, raised wooden platform my grandmother had set up for the toasts. He loudly cleared his throat, arrogantly adjusted his expensive jacket, and smiled down at the crowd exactly like a benevolent king addressing his loyal subjects. "First and foremost, I would very much like to congratulate Elias," he began smoothly. "You are an incredibly brave man willingly marrying into this highly complicated family." A few nervous, uncomfortable chuckles rippled awkwardly through the silent crowd. But I think every single person in this room knows exactly why I am really standing up here tonight. Richard's cold gaze slowly swept the crowd until he found me standing near the back. Something incredibly dark and freezing flickered in his eyes. There has been a massive amount of talk lately. A massive amount of wild speculation regarding my family. I specifically requested that Clara submit to a certified DNA test, and I know for a fact that she finally complied. What I absolutely do not know is why she has been aggressively hiding the scientific results from all of us. The massive room went completely, terrifyingly silent. So, I thought I would be a good father and help her out with the reveal. He confidently reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and extracted a folded piece of paper. My son Julian was kind enough to share a digital copy of the final report with me. Julian actually possessed the basic human decency to look profoundly ashamed, staring at the floorboards. Richard unfolded the paper with agonizing, theatrical slowness. 0% genetic match with Richard Sterling, he read aloud, his voice booming. 0% genetic match with Evelyn Sterling. Loud, dramatic gasps instantly echoed through the massive room. My mother fiercely gripped grandmother Beatrice's hand. 28 long years. Richard's voice suddenly rose in volume, filled with pure, vindicated fury. 28 years I have been desperately telling every single one of you that something was incredibly wrong. And now, the hard science finally proves it. He violently turned his body to face my mother, his face completely contorted with decades of toxic, accumulated resentment. "You lied straight to my face, Evelyn. You maliciously lied to everyone in this room. And now, our entire family knows exactly what kind of filthy woman you really are." The heavy silence that immediately followed his outburst was absolute and suffocating. And then I slowly started walking toward the stage. "You are entirely right about the science, Richard. My voice was incredibly calm and measured as I stepped up onto the platform and firmly took the microphone directly from his hand. He was so incredibly shocked by my boldness that he actually let me take it. The certified DNA test unequivocally shows that I am not your biological daughter. And it also shows that I am not Mom's biological daughter either. Richard's smug smirk widened significantly. A few older relatives exchanged knowing, disgusted glances. But it is absolutely not because Mom had a sordid affair, I continued, my voice echoing loudly. The smirk instantly faltered on his face. I slowly turned around to face the massive crowd. All 60 of them. Every single person who had received that horrific email. Every single relative who had spent years viciously whispering about my mother behind her back. Please, allow me to introduce you to someone very important. I offered a sharp nod toward the side door. Sarah Hayes slowly stepped through the threshold. 28 years old. Thick brown hair, deep brown eyes, and a strong, square jawline that was unmistakably, undeniably a sterling trait. The entire room instantly erupted into chaotic, frantic murmurs. Someone violently dropped a crystal champagne glass, shattering it on the floor. Julian made a strange, strangled, choking sound in the back of his throat. This woman is Sarah Hayes, I announced clearly into the microphone. She was physically born exactly 11 minutes before I was, at the local memorial hospital, on the night of March 15, 1996. On the exact night I was born, there was a catastrophic accident in the ward. A young, exhausted trainee nurse accidentally mixed up 2 newborn babies after their routine bathing. And the hospital administrators aggressively covered up the horrific mistake to avoid a massive, multi-million-dollar lawsuit. I pulled out my cell phone and tapped the screen. The massive wall-mounted digital display I had specifically arranged earlier suddenly flickered to life, brightly showing the official Genesis Analytics reports for all to see. Sarah's certified DNA officially shows a 99.97% genetic match with Richard Sterling. It shows a 99.98% genetic match with Evelyn Sterling. I completely paused, allowing the impossible numbers to fully sink into the minds of the crowd. She is your true, biological daughter, Richard. The exact daughter you have been desperately searching for. And she has been living her entire life 2 states away because a corrupt hospital made a devastating mistake and chose to maliciously hide it from us. Richard's face had gone completely, terrifyingly white. He looked at Sarah. He truly, deeply looked at her face, and I watched 28 years of absolute, arrogant certainty violently crumble into dust behind his eyes. This woman sitting in the corner is Margaret Sullivan. I continued relentlessly, pointing as Margaret slowly rose from her seat. She was the senior head nurse on duty that exact night. She currently possesses a legally notarized statement officially confirming absolutely everything I have just told you. The handwritten shift logs, the hospital cover-up, all of it is documented. Margaret took a hesitant step forward, her voice shaky but incredibly clear. Mr. Sterling, I was physically there. I watched the disaster happen. Your wife never, ever betrayed you. Never. The corrupt hospital executives made all of us sign vicious NDAs. They violently threatened our jobs, our pensions, our livelihoods. I am so profoundly sorry I did not possess the courage to speak up sooner. I slowly turned back to Richard. His shaking hands were now fiercely gripping the edge of the wooden platform like a desperate man trying not to drown in the ocean. You aggressively demanded hard science, Richard. Well, here it is. Every single legal document, every notarized signature, every single one of the 11 minutes that violently changed 2 families forever. At that exact moment, standing proudly on that stage with Sarah right beside me, I felt an emotion I had never, ever experienced in my 28 years on Earth. Absolute vindication. Not a shallow victory for myself, but ultimate, undeniable vindication for my mother. For every single silent tear she had cried in the dark. For every vicious accusation she had been forced to swallow. For every single agonizing, sleepless night she spent desperately wondering if her own husband would ever believe her truth. If this narrative is resonating deeply within your soul, please share it with someone who desperately needs to hear it. Sometimes, The ugly truth takes decades to finally breach the surface. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened when Richard finally comprehended the magnitude of what he had destroyed. Richard Sterling had spent 28 long years being absolutely, fundamentally certain. He was completely certain that his wife had maliciously betrayed his trust. He was certain that his daughter was living proof of her infidelity. He was certain that his deep suspicion made him a righteous victim, that his relentless emotional cruelty was entirely justified, that hard science would eventually, inevitably vindicate his paranoia. Now, the hard science had definitively spoken, and it had utterly, catastrophically destroyed every single foundation he had ever built his entire identity upon. He stared blankly at Sarah, this total stranger possessing his exact jawline, his eyes, his blood. And something deep inside his chest violently shattered. He looked up at the massive DNA results glowing on the digital screen, the irrefutable numbers that proved he was right about my parentage, but catastrophically, horrifically wrong about absolutely everything else. He looked at Margaret Sullivan, whose trembling, tearful testimony had just completely demolished 28 years of his violent accusations. And then, his knees literally buckled beneath him. Richard Sterling, the incredibly proud, arrogant, always certain Richard Sterling, completely collapsed onto the wooden platform exactly like a puppet whose strings had been violently severed. He caught himself heavily on one knee, his large hands slapping loudly against the hardwood floor, his chest heaving with deep, ragged, agonizing breaths. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice broken. "How on earth could I have possibly known?" "How? You could have chosen to trust her." My voice was quiet, but it carried effortlessly through the utterly silent room. "You could have hired private investigators. You could have aggressively looked for other, logical medical explanations instead of immediately assuming the absolute worst about the woman who devoted her life to you. But the blonde hair, the pale eyes. Genetics are incredibly complex, Richard. Recessive genes exist. Catastrophic hospital mistakes happen." I stepped closer, looking down at the broken man who had intentionally made my entire childhood a traumatic battlefield. "But you actively chose paranoia. You actively chose cruelty. For 28 long years, you ruthlessly punished Mom and me for a horrific crime that never actually happened." From across the silent room, I heard a wooden chair scrape aggressively against the floor. Julian, the perpetually silent, overly compliant Julian, suddenly stood up. For a brief, terrifying moment, I genuinely thought he was going to rush the stage and come to his father's defense, exactly like he always had. Instead, he walked right past Richard without offering him a single glance and crossed the room directly to our mother's side. "Mom." His voice cracked with emotion. "I am so incredibly sorry. I should have fiercely defended you years ago. I should have said something." Evelyn immediately pulled him into a fierce, desperate hug, her hot tears quickly soaking into the shoulder of his expensive suit. And Richard remained kneeling on the hard floor, forced to watch his entire family choose each other over him. For 28 years, my mother had existed entirely within Richard Sterling's oppressive, dark shadow. She had painfully endured his vicious accusations at breakfast, at dinner, and every single moment in between. She had cried herself to sleep more nights than any human being could possibly count. She had swallowed his endless cruelty like bitter medicine, desperately telling herself that maybe, just maybe, someday he would finally see the light of truth. Now, the absolute truth was plastered everywhere, glowing on digital screens, printed on legal documents, and staring back at him in the face of a complete stranger who carried her blood. Evelyn slowly stepped forward, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The massive crowd of relatives parted for her like the Red Sea. Even Julian respectfully stepped aside. She stopped directly in front of Richard, who was still resting on one knee, his face soaking wet with tears I had never, ever seen him shed before. 28 agonizing years, Richard. Her voice was incredibly steady, significantly stronger and deeper than I had ever heard it. 28 years. I stayed in that house because I loved you. Because I foolishly believed that someday you would finally trust me again. Because I genuinely thought our broken family was worth fighting for. Richard slowly looked up at her face. Evelyn, I am so. She raised her hand, slicing through the air, instantly cutting him off. Not yet. You absolutely do not get to apologize to me yet. The entire room held its collective breath. You owe me a massive, public apology in front of every single person who received that disgusting email. You owe Clara an apology for every single birthday you deliberately ruined, every graduation you ignored, every single moment you made her feel like a piece of garbage that did not belong in her own home. She forcefully gestured toward Sarah, who was standing frozen in shock near the door. And you owe Sarah a massive apology for failing to be the father she inherently deserved, but never had. Richard's broad shoulders violently shook with deep, agonizing sobs I hadn't known his body was even capable of producing. I didn't need the entire world to believe me, Richard. My mother's voice finally cracked on the very last word. I just desperately needed you to believe me. And you never, ever did. She slowly turned her back on him and walked gracefully over to where Sarah stood. Hello, she said incredibly softly, fresh tears rapidly streaming down her face. I am your mother. I am so incredibly sorry it took us so long to finally find you. It took Richard 3 desperate attempts to physically stand back up. Julian did not offer to help him. I did not help him. Absolutely no one in that room full of relatives, people who had, until 10 minutes ago, blindly believed his twisted version of events, offered him a hand. He heavily gripped the edge of the wooden platform, slowly pulled himself upright, and weakly reached for the microphone I had set down. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely recognizable. It was hoarse, deeply broken, entirely stripped of every single ounce of the massive arrogance I had known my entire life. I was completely wrong. 5 simple words. 28 years overdue. I was wrong about Evelyn. She never. His voice completely shattered. He took a breath and tried again. She never betrayed me. I viciously accused her of infidelity for nearly 3 decades. And I was completely wrong. He slowly looked at me, and for the very first time in my entire life, I saw something other than dark suspicion and hatred in his eyes. Clara, I took things from you that I can never, ever give back. Your innocent childhood, your basic trust, the money that absolutely should have been yours to build a life. He swallowed hard. I will completely repay your crushing student loans. All of them. Tomorrow. I know it is absolutely not enough, but it is a start. Then he slowly turned his body toward Sarah. This complete stranger who was actually his biological daughter. This woman he had never held as an infant, never known, never had the opportunity to disappoint. I honestly do not know what to say to you. You are my daughter, and I have tragically missed absolutely everything. Your very first steps, your graduations, your entire existence. His voice completely shattered into pieces on the final words. That is something I will deeply, agonizingly regret until the day I am put in the ground. Sarah was openly crying too. We all were at this point. But her voice remained incredibly steady. We can start trying right now, she said softly. But only if you are actually willing to be a real father instead of a cruel judge. Richard nodded his head vigorously, completely unable to speak. My grandmother Beatrice slowly stepped forward and silently handed him a tissue from her purse. Clean your face up, Richard, she said, her tone absolutely not unkind, but firm. You have a massive amount of hard work ahead of you. Exactly 1 week after the explosive engagement party, I drove 3 hours to Sarah's hometown. The house was a very modest, charming colonial situated in a quiet, leafy suburb. It featured white siding, bright blue shutters, and a sprawling garden of wildflowers that had clearly been someone's passionate labor of love. It was a very far cry from my grandmother's massive estate or Richard's aggressive Tudor mansion, but it felt warm and inviting in a way those houses had never quite managed. Linda Hayes answered the front door before I even had the chance to knock. She was 56 years old, with bright blonde hair elegantly streaked with silver, and piercing blue eyes that were an exact, flawless mirror of my own. Looking at her face was exactly like looking into a magical time machine. This was undeniably who I was going to become in 30 years. Clara. Her voice caught painfully on my name. "I have been staring endlessly at your photograph all week long." I kept thinking I was trapped in a beautiful dream. She fiercely pulled me into a tight hug that smelled strongly of lavender and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something that felt impossibly, wonderfully like home. We sat together in her cozy kitchen for 4 solid hours. She proudly showed me massive albums of photographs from her childhood, pictures of my biological grandparents who had unfortunately passed away years ago. Snapshots of the beautiful life I might have lived if a careless trainee nurse hadn't made a catastrophic mistake. She told me all about her ex-husband, David, my biological father, who had tragically died of aggressive cancer 3 years ago, going to his grave never knowing that Sarah wasn't actually his blood. He used to always joke that Sarah possessed old soul eyes, Linda said, wiping her tears with a checkered kitchen towel. "Now I finally understand. They were your eyes, Clara. They were always your eyes." I showed her hundreds of pictures of my childhood, too. The bright blonde baby growing up in a massive house full of dark-haired people. The little girl who never quite fit into the puzzle. The woman who had finally, miraculously found out why. "I absolutely do not want to aggressively replace Evelyn," Linda said carefully. "She lovingly raised you. She is your mother." "She absolutely is," I agreed softly. "But maybe there is plenty of room in my heart for one more." Linda's radiant smile could have easily lit up the entire house. "I would really, really like that," she said. "I would like that very much." 2 months later, I happily married Elias in the blooming rose garden of the Sterling estate, entirely surrounded by sparkling fairy lights and family, both the family I was biologically born into and the family I was lovingly raised by. My mother, Evelyn, proudly walked me down the aisle. Not Richard. My mother. She wore a stunning champagne-colored dress and held her head incredibly high, her footsteps steady and confident for the very first time in decades. Beside her, I wore the breathtaking designer gown that she and my grandmother had fiercely insisted on purchasing for me. A proper, elegant wedding dress for a proper wedding, Beatrice had loudly declared. Richard sat quietly in the second row, looking incredibly quiet and physically diminished. He didn't protest for a single second when I firmly told him he would not be walking me down the aisle. He didn't attempt to argue when I explained that this specific moment belonged entirely to my mother's triumph, not his ego. He just slowly nodded his head and said, "I completely understand." It was a very small start. Sarah stood proudly with my bridesmaids, wearing a deep, emerald green dress that perfectly brought out the rich brown in her eyes. Our mother's eyes. Richard's eyes. She had been formally introduced to the Sterling family in the weeks following the explosive party. It involved many tentative lunches and incredibly careful, fragile conversations that were slowly, painstakingly building towards something resembling a real relationship. Linda Hayes sat proudly in the very front row of the guest section, a prominent place of honor. She waved enthusiastically when she caught my eye during the ceremony, her own blue eyes shining brightly with happy tears. My grandmother Beatrice rose to deliver a toast at the reception. "This beautiful wedding is not just about 2 young people finding love," Beatrice announced, proudly raising her crystal champagne glass. "It is about 2 entire families finally finding their way out of the darkness and back to the truth. It is about a brave daughter who absolutely refused to accept a toxic lie and a resilient mother who waited 28 agonizing years to finally be believed." She looked directly at me, then over at Sarah, then down at Evelyn. "To the absolute truth," she declared, her voice ringing out. "However long it takes to find it. To the truth." The entire room echoed back, and I gladly drank to that. The subsequent medical malpractice lawsuit took 8 grueling months to settle. Sarah and I formally filed a joint lawsuit against the local Memorial Hospital, aggressively represented by a ruthless medical malpractice attorney my grandmother had personally retained. She was a brilliant woman who specialized exclusively in wrongful birth cases and possessed, she told us with a razor-thin smile, a particular, passionate interest in massive institutions that arrogantly think they can cover up their catastrophic mistakes. Margaret Sullivan willingly testified, her notarized legal statement backed entirely by the original, handwritten shift log she had kept securely hidden for 28 years. The hospital's aggressive corporate lawyers desperately tried to discredit her testimony, citing her advanced age, her signed NDA, and her delayed disclosure. It absolutely did not work. Damning internal documents rapidly surfaced during the legal discovery phase. Emails between senior hospital administrators actively discussing the incident in 1996. Memos discussing risk mitigation strategies. A specific, hidden budget line item labeled potential liability settlement that had been quietly, illegally renewed every single year since the incident. They had known. They had always known. And they had spent nearly 3 decades desperately praying that absolutely no one would ever uncover the truth. In the bitter end, the hospital executives chose to offer a massive settlement rather than face the sheer public humiliation of a jury trial. They paid $450,000 to each family, for a massive total of $900,000. They were legally forced to print a full public apology in the local newspaper. They were mandated to implement massive, structural improvements to their newborn identification security protocols. And the senior administrator, who had maliciously ordered the original cover-up, who had long since retired, was publicly named and shamed in the press. We absolutely did not sue for petty revenge, I firmly told a local news reporter who showed up at the courthouse steps. We sued them so that no other family on Earth will ever have to spend 28 years living a toxic lie that a hospital could have easily corrected in a single day. Margaret Sullivan was legally granted full immunity from any personal liability in exchange for her vital cooperation. She mailed me a beautiful thank you card afterward, her handwriting shaky but incredibly clear. Thank you for finally giving me a reason to tell the truth. I can finally sleep peacefully now. I securely kept the card in a locked drawer right next to my birth certificate. The real, corrected one. The one that accurately said 11:58 p.m. The one that finally told the absolute truth. 6 months after my wedding, Richard unexpectedly invited me out to dinner. Just the two of us. He had surprisingly chosen a very quiet, unassuming Italian restaurant in the downtown district. Not the elite country club, not anywhere flashy or pretentious. Just a simple corner booth featuring checkered tablecloths, cheap candles, and basic wine bottles. He looked significantly older than he had at my engagement party. Grayer. Physically smaller somehow, as if the massive weight of his public confession had physically diminished his stature. I really wanted to thank you, he said quietly after we had ordered our food, for graciously agreeing to see me. You are absolutely not my biological father, I stated firmly. You never were. But you did raise me, even if you did it incredibly badly. He visibly flinched at the harsh words, but slowly nodded his head. I am actively in intensive therapy now, he confessed. Evelyn strongly insisted. Well, she aggressively suggested it. We are doing intense couples counseling, too. We have been legally separated, but we are actively trying to. He trailed off, desperately searching for the right words. We are desperately trying to find out if there is absolutely anything left between us worth saving. I thought deeply about my mother. I thought about the powerful, defiant way she had stood in front of him at the engagement party, fiercely demanding the public apology she had deserved for decades. I thought about the immense, unimaginable strength it must have taken her to even consider rebuilding a life after absolutely everything he had put her through. I vividly remember when you patiently taught me how to ride a bicycle, I said softly. I was 5 years old. It was before you knew about before you violently decided I wasn't yours. You tightly held the seat and ran right beside me for an entire hour until I finally got the balance right. Richard's eyes rapidly filled with thick tears. I remember that day perfectly, he whispered. That is the exact father I desperately needed growing up, I said. The one who held on. I am willing to try to build a relationship, Richard. But I desperately need you to understand something. Forgiveness is a long, grueling process, not a singular magical event. And you have a massive amount of hard work to do to earn it. He nodded solemnly. I know I do. And I will absolutely do it. However long it takes. I absolutely did not forgive him that night. I am honestly not entirely sure if I have fully forgiven him yet, but I actively chose to give him the one chance my mother never, ever got, the chance to actually prove he was capable of change. Sarah and Julian officially met for the very first time at a chaotic family dinner exactly a month after my wedding. It was incredibly, painfully awkward at first. How exactly do you effortlessly make small talk with the biological sibling you should have grown up with? The brother who received the privileged childhood that absolutely should have been yours? But then, Julian casually mentioned that he was deathly allergic to shellfish. Wait, Sarah said, her eyes widening. I am too. Since birth. The doctor explicitly told me it was a genetic trait. What about being naturally left-handed? Julian asked, leaning forward. Sarah proudly held up her left hand. No way. Julian laughed loudly. A real, genuine laugh, completely surprised and delighted. What about music? What obscure bands do you listen to? 30 minutes later, they excitedly discovered that they both obsessively loved an incredibly obscure indie folk band that absolutely nobody else in either family had ever even heard of. They both vehemently hated the taste of cilantro with an inexplicable, burning passion. And they both possessed a bizarre habit of nervously tapping their right foot whenever they were deep in thought. This is so incredibly weird, Julian said, shaking his head in disbelief. You are literally exactly like looking in a mirror. But, you know, a female version. I was going to confidently say shorter. Sarah laughed, playfully throwing a dinner roll across the table at him. And for the very first time in my entire memory, a Sterling family dinner was filled with genuine, unscripted laughter. Not the polite, strained, artificial kind that my mother had always worked so desperately hard to manufacture, but real, deep laughter. The kind that only comes from people who are genuinely, truly happy to be sitting in a room together. It was a very small, seemingly insignificant moment, but it felt exactly like the beautiful beginning of something entirely new. 3 months after my wedding, Evelyn and Linda officially met for lunch. I was not physically present, but my mother recounted the details to me later, her voice incredibly soft with wonder. They had strategically chosen a quiet cafe exactly halfway between their houses, neutral, safe ground, exactly as Sarah and I had done months earlier. Linda had brought massive photo albums detailing Sarah's entire childhood. Evelyn had brought thick albums full of photos of mine. They had sat in that cafe for over 3 hours, tearfully trading intimate stories about the beautiful daughters they had lovingly raised, but had not birthed. She told me absolutely everything about Sarah's very first words, Evelyn said. And I told her all about yours. We both cried a massive amount. Was it incredibly strange? I asked her. Physically meeting the woman who raised your biological daughter? My mother quietly considered the question for a very long moment. I honestly thought it would be horrifying, she admitted. I thought I would feel, I don't know, insanely jealous or deeply resentful. But when I finally looked at her face, all I could think was that she loved Sarah in the exact same, fierce way I loved you. Completely without question. She reached across the table and took my hand. We tragically lost 28 years, Clara, she said. But we miraculously gained each other. And we finally gained the absolute truth. That has to count for something monumental in this life. Linda and Evelyn now actively meet for lunch together exactly once a month. They have become incredibly close friends, a highly unlikely, beautiful friendship born entirely from shared trauma, massive loss, and unexpected connection. They playfully call each other the other mother. And in a very strange, beautiful way, I strongly believe it has helped both of them profoundly heal. I am currently sitting in our beautiful new apartment. It is a spacious 2-bedroom in a significantly nicer, quieter part of the city, with plenty of room for Elias's home architectural office and a bright space for the nursery we will urgently need very soon. The walls are completely covered with framed photographs. My beautiful wedding day, featuring my mother Evelyn standing proudly on one side and Linda Hayes beaming on the other. A picture of Sarah and me laughing at Thanksgiving, our very first major holiday spent together. My grandmother Beatrice looking incredibly triumphant and regal at her birthday party last month. Elias is currently in the kitchen making dinner. He is attempting something incredibly complicated with far too many ingredients. He has been on a massive culinary kick lately. I have been thinking incredibly deeply about the past year, about the complex nature of identity, the definition of family, and exactly what it truly means to belong somewhere. For 28 long years, I desperately tried to prove that I was a true Sterling. I constantly straightened my blonde hair to make it look darker. I painfully learned how to golf simply because Richard loved golf. I studied practical nursing instead of following my passion for art because nursing was reliable, not something a parasitic cuckoo's egg would ever choose. I spent my entire life frantically trying to contort myself to fit into a rigid mold that was absolutely never meant for me. Now, I finally know with absolute certainty that I was never, ever supposed to fit. I was someone else's biological daughter. I was living someone else's entire life. I was carrying someone else's DNA inside my cells. But here is the absolute most important lesson I have learned through all this pain. DNA absolutely does not make a family. The woman who tightly held my hand during terrifying nightmares, the woman who patiently taught me how to read books, the woman who tragically stayed married to a monster who tortured her simply to keep our broken family together. That woman is my mother. Not because of biology, because of fierce, undeniable love. Elias walks into the living room carrying 2 steaming plates and a very knowing smile. "You are doing that exact thing again," he teases gently. The deep, intense thinking while staring blankly at nothing thing. I laugh loudly and gratefully take the plate he offers. Resting on the coffee table, tucked safely between a massive stack of baby-name books and a new pregnancy journal, is the plastic test I took early this morning. Positive. I honestly do not know whose complex DNA this new baby will carry. Mine, Elias's, some distant echo of the Hayes lineage or the Sterlings. But I know one thing for absolute, undeniable certain. This child will know they are fiercely, unconditionally loved from the very first moment they draw breath. Without any conditions. Without any cruel doubt. And that is the absolute only proof of family that matters. If you are listening to this right now and you have ever been violently accused of something horrific that you absolutely did not do, by a parent, by a partner, by anyone who is biologically obligated to trust you, I desperately want you to know that the truth always, eventually, has a way of violently breaching the surface. Sometimes it takes 28 agonizing years. Sometimes it takes a complex DNA test and a brave, elderly nurse suffering from a guilty conscience. But it always surfaces. Do not ever let anyone else's toxic suspicion define your inherent worth. And if you are the person constantly doing the cruel accusing, I beg you to ask yourself, is my absolute, arrogant certainty truly worth destroying the people I claim to love? My father spent 28 years being absolutely, arrogantly certain. He was completely certain my mother was a cheater. He was certain I wasn't his blood. He was certain his relentless emotional cruelty was justified. He was certain that science would eventually vindicate his paranoia. He was catastrophically wrong about absolutely all of it. Trust is an active, daily choice. Paranoia and doubt are incredibly easy. But 28 years of toxic doubt can completely destroy a family. 28 years of basic trust could have miraculously saved mine. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who desperately needs to hear it. Check the description for more empowering stories exactly like this one. Until next time, fiercely trust the truth, even when it is hiding in the dark.